Normandy, 1944. The lane does not look dangerous at first. It is narrow, sunken, bordered by hedgerows and churned mud, another piece of rural France bruised by war. Then the firing starts, short bursts, controlled, precise, and the lane reveals what it truly is. A corridor where time itself has been weaponized. At the far end, a German bunker waits. Its concrete face is blunt, unfinished, indifferent. A single firing slit cuts across the lane at chest height, placed not for drama, but for certainty. From that opening, a machine gun governs movement. Not constantly, intelligently. The pauses are as lethal as the fire because they tempt men to move. Every step forward must be negotiated with the rhythm of the gun. Too early, and the bullets arrive before the body finishes the motion. Too late, and men stack behind cover that does not exist. The impacts are small, chips of white concrete, spurts of dirt, but the effect is absolute. The bunker does not need to kill everyone. It only needs to stop them. Grenades are thrown. One strikes the angled lip and skips back, forcing men to recoil from their own violence. Another detonates harmlessly below the aperture, its blast wasted against geometry. Rifle fire follows instinctively, cracking against concrete and achieving nothing. This position has been designed to absorb courage and return silence. A corporal lies flat in the mud, his face pressed into damp earth, and listens. He does not look for orders. He listens for pattern. The gun inside fires in phrases: 3 seconds, pause, 2 seconds, pause, then a longer sweep that cleans the lane. He counts without moving his lips. This is not hope, it is calculation. Behind him, a weapon is dragged forward that looks wrong for a battlefield. A tube. Weld seams visible, stamped metal instead of polish. It rattles when shifted. Someone mutters, "Plumber's trash," the remark sharp with distrust. Soldiers have always mocked the tools they fear they might have to trust. The corporal does not turn. His attention fixes on a shallow fold in the ground, just outside the machine gun's angle. A dead space, narrow, imperfect, but real. When the next pause comes, he slides into it, body flattened, breath held, time compressed. In his hands, the crude tube gun offers no promise of elegance or distance, only immediacy. Because the fight is about to collapse inward, from lane to doorway. And when it does, 4 seconds will decide whether the nickname survives. Britain came back from Dunkirk in late May and early June 1940 with something that looked, on paper, like deliverance. More than 300,000 men rescued from the beaches. But the rescue carried a silent cost. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, radios. Much of it had been abandoned in the sand so the living could reach the boats. The army returned intact in body, but stripped of the tools that made it an army. Across the channel, the threat did not fade. It intensified. The prospect of German troops crossing the narrow water and forcing a decision on British soil turned procurement into an emergency calculation. There was no time for ideal solutions, no patience for refinement. The question facing planners was unforgiving: arm quickly or meet invasion with courage alone. Training grounds across Britain exposed the problem without mercy. Recruits drilled movements and formations, learned commands and signals, and then reached the moment when a weapon should have been issued. Often, there was nothing. Sometimes one rifle served several men, passed down the line like a borrowed instrument. Morale did not collapse, but realism set in. The weakness was not will. It was supply. Inside the War Office, assumptions hardened. In peacetime, weapons were judged by balance, finish, and mechanical elegance. In 1940, those measures began to look irrelevant. A beautifully machined firearm that arrived too late was useless. Elegance, officials concluded, was a preference of safety. Britain was no longer safe. The requirement was rewritten with deliberate bluntness: cheap, simple, effective at close range, and quickly teachable. The weapon did not need to impress. It needed to exist, in numbers large enough to matter. It had to be built by hands that were available, not by craftsmen who were scarce. Factories were reassigned. Workshops that once produced civilian goods were folded into wartime schedules. Welding replaced polishing. Output replaced pride. Survival became an industrial discipline, measured in shifts, quotas, and tolerances, not speeches. And in that atmosphere of urgency and acceptance, Britain began to trade romance for readiness, setting the conditions for a weapon that would look crude, sound unrefined, and arrive exactly when it was needed. In 1940, Britain's engineers began to design with a new kind of honesty. Refinement was no longer a virtue, it was a delay. The question was not how to make the best weapon in the world, but how to make a weapon that could be made at all, quickly, in volume, and with machines that had never been intended for firearms. Part count became strategy. Every component removed was another hour saved, another skilled hand freed for something else. What emerged was not a traditional gun so much as an industrial answer. A simple tube receiver, stamped steel where milled steel would have once been demanded. Weld seams visible, unapologetic. The silhouette looked less like a rifle and more like plumbing, something you might find in a workshop, not on a parade ground. It was bare bones by design, stripped down until function was almost embarrassing. To soldiers, appearances mattered. A weapon carried into battle is also carried into the mind. Troops distrusted anything that looked improvised, even when the improvisation was deliberate engineering. There is an old instinct in armies. If it looks cheap, it must be unreliable. And reliability is not a technical detail when your life depends on it. It is a form of faith, yet the very ugliness became the signature. It was proof of its origin, built not in comfort, but under pressure, when Britain's factories were being asked to produce salvation in shifts and quotas. It carried the aesthetic of emergency, harsh edges, rough finishes, and a shape that made no attempt to inspire pride. In a strange way, it told the truth. This was not a weapon born of tradition. It was born of necessity. Nicknames began to circulate before manuals could keep up. Ridicule travels faster than instruction because it requires no discipline, only a comment and a laugh. Men called it crude, called it ugly, called it something made for plumbers rather than soldiers. The words were a shield against dependence. If you mock a tool, you do not have to admit you need it. But shipments moved faster than doubt. Crates arrived, arms were issued, training continued. Need did what persuasion could not. When a nation faces invasion, contempt becomes a luxury item. And the deeper lesson was already forming, quiet and unromantic. Wars do not always reward what is best designed. They often reward what can be built, fast enough to arrive before the enemy does. By the end of 1940, British policy stopped pretending that the war could be met with ideals. It hardened into something colder and more durable, a willingness to arm many men quickly, even if the weapons were imperfect. This was not a celebration of cheapness. It was an acceptance of reality. The nation had watched Europe fall with modern weapons in practiced hands, and it had returned from Dunkirk with far too few of its own. In that context, perfection was not a standard. It was a delay. The decision was often described in political language, but its logic was mathematical. If invasion came, it would not arrive as a debate. It would arrive as bodies and boats, and the need to meet them at hedgerows, bridges, stairwells, and factory yards. A small number of superb weapons would not defend an island if the men holding them were outnumbered, or if the rest stood empty-handed. Britain's planners understood that bravery without equipment becomes a kind of organized sacrifice. So workshops were repurposed with a speed that would have looked reckless in peacetime. Civilian production lines were stripped and reassembled. Jigs were built. Presses were recalibrated. Welding became common where machining had once been required. The work carried no romance. It was loud, repetitive, and often crude. But it produced something war cares about more than elegance: output. In those months, output became a form of armor, not worn on the body, but spread across the nation. This industrial shift demanded a second transformation inside the army itself. Training could no longer be built around pride or tradition. It had to be built around handling and drills. Men were taught not to admire their weapons, but to understand them. How to load by touch, how to clear stoppages, how to keep magazines functioning, how to avoid the small errors that a simple mechanism would not forgive. The weapon was cheap, yes, but discipline was not. Discipline had to be manufactured. A recruit learned this lesson quickly. The first time he held the crude tube gun, it felt wrong. Unbalanced, unfamiliar, almost like a temporary measure that had been mistakenly issued as permanent. Yet the drill sergeant did not allow opinion. The motions were repeated until they became habit. Because in war, confidence is rarely a feeling. It is a product of repetition under pressure. Men do not rise to their beliefs when the moment comes. They fall back on what they have practiced. Slowly, the weapon's purpose was clarified in language that had nothing to do with admiration. It was not meant for long-range marksmanship or for battlefield prestige. It was meant for sudden control at close distance, for the moment when a hallway, a trench corner, a bunker entrance, or a hedgerow gap compresses the fight into a few feet of space. In those spaces, precision can become secondary. The decisive currency is time. That was the real belief taking shape. Tempo. Britain was betting that if the fight came, whether on the beaches of Kent or later on the fields of France, its men would not arrive to the critical seconds unarmed. They would arrive already holding something that could end a decision quickly. And in the shadows of this policy, the next question waited. What happens when a weapon designed for speed is placed into the tight geometry of real combat, where distance disappears and seconds begin to count like lives? The weapon's genius, if it could be called that, lay not in invention, but in reduction. Its mechanism was designed for one purpose: close-range speed. Where traditional firearms carried the dignity of careful machining and refined tolerances, this one was built around a harsh idea: make it simple enough to produce quickly and direct enough to end a fight before it becomes complicated. In the hands, it felt light, almost blunt. The tube receiver and minimal furniture reduced weight, and that mattered more than comfort in the places it was meant to be used. Close combat is not a firing range. It is a corridor, a stairwell, a trench bend, a bunker entrance where air is stale and hearing is saturated with noise. In those spaces, fine aim can vanish under adrenaline. What remains is handling, how quickly a weapon can be brought up, pointed, and made to speak. But simplicity always collects a debt. The same stripped-down design that made the gun easy to build also made it unforgiving. A stoppage at the wrong second did not become a technical inconvenience. It became a verdict. The weapon demanded a kind of discipline that contradicted its rough appearance. Magazines had to be cared for, springs kept functional, feeding surfaces respected. Men learned quickly that cheap did not mean carefree. It meant that the soldier supplied what the factory could not: attention, routine, and habit. So the gun was taught as a system, not an object. Soldiers were drilled not only in firing, but in everything that made firing possible: how to load without damaging the lips of a magazine, how to keep dirt from turning moving parts into sandpaper, how to recognize the early signs of failure before failure arrived. Instructors spoke less about pride and more about procedure. In the end, the weapon worked best when a man treated it with the seriousness its appearance did not suggest. Its advantage was time, not theoretical time measured in rate of fire, but practical time, the short interval between seeing a target and changing the situation. A controlled burst at close range could end a decision early, before the enemy could move, think, or retreat. That mattered in battles where the margin between life and death was sometimes no more than a second of hesitation. In confined spaces, immediacy often defeated precision. A long-range rifleman could be brilliant at 200 yards and still be helpless in a doorway. Inside a bunker, there is no generous distance in which to correct mistakes. There is only the brutal compression of space. A weapon that can deliver decisive force quickly becomes, in those moments, a kind of key, opening the next room by shutting down the threat inside it. And this was the moral clarity the war imposed. The weapon's value was not universal. It was defined by distance. At range, it was limited, even unimpressive. Up close, it became something else entirely, an answer to a problem that concrete and angles had made almost insoluble. The question now was whether the enemy understood this too, because German doctrine had built its confidence on the assumption that hardened positions could not be evicted quickly. German defensive doctrine in the Second World War did not rely on courage alone. It relied on engineering. A hardened position, properly sited, properly built, properly supported, was meant to turn an attacker's strength into a liability. Interlocking fields of fire stitched the landscape together. One bunker covered another. One machine gun did not simply kill, it shaped movement, forcing men into lanes where the next gun was already waiting. Concrete became more than material. It became psychology. For the defender, it promised permanence. Walls thick enough to outlast artillery fragments, ceilings meant to absorb shock, narrow apertures that reduced exposure. Inside, men could believe they were safer than the chaos outside suggested. For the attacker, the same structure created a different feeling: helplessness. The bunker looked like something the war could not touch. It stood there as if it had always been there. These positions were designed around killing zones. Open ground was left open on purpose, cleared of cover, measured in angles and distances. Movement through those zones was punished immediately. Hesitation was punished more quietly, as men bunched behind the nearest ditch or crater, waiting for an opening that never arrived. In this way, the defenses did not simply defeat assault, they slowed it, broke it into fragments, and turned momentum into caution. Over time, certain positions gained reputations. They were described as unclearable, not as a technical assessment, but as a kind of battlefield superstition. That belief was useful to the defense. It substituted for flexibility. If a bunker was considered unbeatable, men would hold it longer, and attackers would waste more time trying to solve it with the wrong tools. Confidence, in war, is often a weapon of its own. But the battlefield teaches harsh distinctions. Attackers learned that suppression is not eviction. You can keep a bunker's head down with fire, you can blind it with smoke, you can strike its face with explosives. Yet none of that guarantees the moment that matters most, the moment when the defender is physically removed from the position. A bunker is not defeated when it is frightened. It is defeated when it is entered. This is where the logic of concrete becomes vulnerable. The very design that makes the bunker formidable at distance makes it restrictive up close. Narrow angles protect against bullets, but they also limit vision. Thick walls resist shells, but they also trap sound and confusion inside. A position built to dominate the outside world can become a cage when the fight moves to the doorway. And that is the quiet irony of certainty. When a defense places too much faith in structure, it invites the enemy to bring tools meant for entry, tools that do not argue with concrete, but bypass it. Not more artillery, not more heroism, something faster, closer, and brutally decisive. Because once an assault team reaches the blind spot and the threshold, the bunker's entire advantage can collapse into a single compressed instant, one short interval where distance disappears, and war is decided in seconds. To clear a bunker is to admit a hard truth. Firepower alone is not enough. Armies learned this early in the war, and they learned it again and again at a cost paid in small, brutal numbers. You could pound concrete with artillery and still leave a machine gun alive inside. You could pin a firing slit with rifles and still fail to move the defender from his position. The problem was not simply killing, it was entry. And entry required training that felt less like marksmanship and more like surgery. Assault schools began to teach a sequence, repeated until it became reflex: suppress, blind, flank, enter. Suppression kept the defender's head down, not to win, but to buy seconds. Blinding, through smoke, dust, and concussion, stole vision and rhythm. Flanking turned the bunker's strongest angles into irrelevant ones. And then, finally, entry forced the fight into a place the defender had never wanted it to go, inside his own fortification. Smoke became more than concealment. It became a tool of timing. Instructors spoke of it the way a craftsman speaks of measuring tape. Not dramatic, simply necessary. Smoke clouds the slit, interrupts the gunner's confidence, and fractures the sense of control that concrete is meant to provide. Grenades, too, were not treated as symbols of aggression, but as instruments, thrown not for heroism, but for rhythm. A detonation at the right moment could freeze a defender, make him flinch, make him pause. And in close assault, a pause can be a doorway. The men were trained to move as one because bunkers feed on isolation. A bunker does not simply kill, it separates. It forces one soldier forward while the others hesitate. It makes a man feel alone at the exact moment he most needs cohesion. Assault teams were therefore drilled in shared movement. One man providing covering fire, another carrying smoke, another ready to follow, another to enter. Each role was simple, but the sequence demanded trust. If one man stopped, the whole motion collapsed. In that training, there was a quiet cruelty. Soldiers were taught to rehearse the moments most likely to unmake them, loading in darkness, clearing stoppages without looking, changing magazines while crouched, while breathing hard, while hands trembled from exertion. Fear destroys finesse, and the instructors knew it. The purpose of repetition was not to make a man brave. It was to make him functional when bravery was insufficient. This was where the crude tube gun found its place. It was not assigned a heroic role, and it was not treated as a wonder. It was treated as a practical voice, something that could speak loudly at arm's length when the fight moved too close for elegance. Instructors did not talk about accuracy in the abstract. They talked about what happens when a man is 3 steps from a doorway, when the air is thick, when the defender is unseen, and when the only honest aim is to control a small space quickly before the defender can react. As the war progressed, the battlefield itself began to resemble these drills. It shifted into enclosed spaces where distance collapsed without warning. Trenches carved into mud, ditches running beside roads, rooms shattered by shell fire, narrow stairwells in bombed towns, and concrete positions built into the land like tumors. Even in open country, terrain created confinement. Hedges created corridors, rubble created corners, and every corner became a place where the next few seconds would matter more than the last few hours. The men who approached those corners did not feel heroic. That is the myth told afterward, in cleaner language. In the moment, they felt responsible. Responsible for the men behind them, responsible for the line moving forward, responsible for doing a job that no one could do from a safe distance. The doorway did not offer glory. It offered obligation, and that obligation demanded a kind of mental narrowing. You could not carry the whole war into a bunker entrance. You carried only the next sequence: suppress, blind, flank, enter. Your world shrank to the width of an opening, to the sound of a machine gun inside, to the weight of a magazine in your hand. The larger causes, strategy, politics, speeches, fell away. In that moment, war became technical, because the final problem remained unchanged. Hardened positions were built to make attackers hesitate. Assault schools existed to remove hesitation from the body through habit. And when those habits met concrete in the real world, when drills became reality, the question was no longer whether a bunker could be cleared. The question was whether it could be cleared fast enough to matter. The first time a weapon earns respect, it is rarely in a clean demonstration. It happens in the middle of a stalled advance, when the plan has narrowed to a single point of failure. A fortified position, small on a map, enormous in reality, pins men to the earth, not with spectacle, but with the steady authority of fire. The casualties appear in small numbers at first. One man clipped while moving, another struck while trying to drag him back, a third wounded because he rose half a second too early. The numbers are not yet catastrophic. That is what makes the delay so dangerous. It feels survivable right up until it is not. They try what experience suggests. Grenades are thrown toward the firing slit, meant to punish the gunner behind it. But the bunker's angles do what they were built to do. A grenade strikes the lip and returns the way a bad idea returns, fast, humiliating, and lethal to its owner. Another rolls into a fold of ground and explodes harmlessly, its force absorbed by dirt and distance. The position remains. The gun remains. The lane remains closed. Then a gunner begins to move, not forward in a rush, but forward in increments. He crawls into dead ground, the shallow space where the bunker's fire cannot quite reach. His world shrinks to inches of mud and the sound of the machine gun above him. He reads rhythm the way a mechanic reads an engine, by bursts, pauses, and the small falls of dust when rounds strike concrete. He is not thinking in heroic terms. He is thinking in timing. He reaches the blind spot, close enough that the air changes. Smoke has a smell at that distance, sharp, oily, mixed with the damp mineral scent of concrete that has been sweating under pressure. The bunker is no longer an abstract threat. It is a presence. He can hear movement inside between bursts, the faint scrape of boots, the metal clack of a mechanism being fed. The defender is not a silhouette now. He is a man behind a wall, trusting that wall to keep the world out. Entry happens suddenly because it must. There is no slow way to step into a fortified doorway without being killed. The gunner rises, moves into the threshold, and the space becomes darkness punctured by muzzle flash. The crude tube gun speaks in controlled bursts, short, decisive, close enough that recoil and sound fill the room. There is no distance for the defender to use, no generous range to correct mistakes. The bunker's strength becomes its trap. The very confinement that protected the gunner's position now denies him escape. Inside, the fight lasts only moments. Concrete amplifies noise, smoke thickens, then it thins. The machine gun that had governed the lane falls silent, not because it was suppressed, but because it has been physically removed from the equation. Outside, the change is immediate. Men who had been pinned feel the pressure lift, as if a hand has been taken from their throats. The advance resumes, not triumphantly, but mechanically, because that is what war demands when one obstacle is solved and another waits ahead. And in that small, decisive proof, a revelation settles into memory. Elegance does not clear bunkers, geometry does. The weapon that looked like Plumber's trash has found the one place it was built to matter, and the war now will give it more of those places. A weapon designed for mass production carries an unintended consequence. It does not stay where planners expect it to stay. The same simplicity that allows factories to build it quickly also allows it to move quickly, through supply chains, across borders, into hands that were never meant to hold military steel. In the formal language of logistics, this is distribution. In the quieter language of occupied Europe, it becomes something else entirely: possibility. Because the gun's design did not demand specialized care, it could be taught in short time. It did not require a long apprenticeship in marksmanship to be useful. A magazine could be loaded, a safety understood, a burst controlled. For professional soldiers, it was a tool. For resistance cells living under occupation, it became an equalizer. valuable not because it was impressive, but because it was attainable. They did not treat it as a trophy. They treated it as a means to change the balance inside a room, inside a street, inside a single moment. In hidden apartments and back rooms, training took on a different character than it did in barracks. There were no parade grounds, no formal manuals laid out on tables. There were whispered instructions, hurried demonstrations, and the constant knowledge that discovery meant prison, or worse. The simplicity of the weapon mattered here in a way that official procurement officers could never fully measure. Complexity invites error. Error invites capture. And there was another transformation, quieter still. A civilian who grips a weapon for the first time does not only feel metal and weight, he feels a moral threshold. The line is crossed without fanfare. An object meant to take life has entered his hands. The war is no longer a distant contest between armies, it has become personal. The decision is no longer whether to endure occupation, but whether to act against it, and accept what that action will bring back. Once that line was crossed, the weapon became a tool of disruption. A burst fired in the dark could do more than kill. It could break the occupier's sense of calm. It could force patrols to move differently, to hesitate, to suspect the shadows. It could turn everyday routines into threats. Occupation depends on predictability. It requires the belief that the state, however hated, is still in control. A cheap weapon in hidden hands undermines that belief more effectively than speeches ever can. Authorities noticed quickly. Occupying forces discovered an uncomfortable weakness. When a weapon is cheap enough to be produced in volume, it is also cheap enough to appear in unexpected places. Its presence in the resistance did not need to be widespread to be effective. Even rumors could change behavior. Even the possibility of close-range fire in an alley could force men to walk in tighter groups, to carry more caution, to burn more time. In war, fear is an expense, and the occupier began to pay it. This was the political life of industrial design. Innovation was no longer confined to the battlefield. A weapon created to solve a tactical problem, how to win seconds at close distance, began to shape power behind the lines. It taught an old lesson with modern speed. Technology does not merely kill, it redistributes leverage. It changes what small groups can do, and therefore what large authorities must fear. In that shadow front, the same simplicity that saved soldiers at a bunker entrance multiplied pressure in occupied streets and quiet towns. It carried the war into places where uniforms were rare and consequences were immediate. The weapon did not become glamorous. It became practical, and practicality, under occupation, is a kind of rebellion. And as this pressure grew behind the lines, another battlefield was forming in the open, Normandy's hedgerows, where distance would collapse again and again, forcing every side to fight not for miles, but for the next few steps. Normandy did not fight like the maps suggested it would. From the air, the countryside looked open, fields, lanes, scattered villages. On the ground, it was a maze. The bocage hedgerows were not simple bushes, they were earthworks grown old, thick with roots, reinforced by centuries of farming. Each field was a compartment, each lane a corridor. Visibility collapsed into narrow slices, and the war, so often imagined as movement across wide front lines, became a series of sudden encounters measured in feet. In that terrain, distance was never guaranteed. A man could advance for an hour and see nothing, then turn a corner and find the enemy 10 steps away. A hedge might hide a machine gun until the moment it fired. A sunken road could become a funnel. A doorway could conceal a rifleman who had been waiting in silence. Normandy forced soldiers into a kind of intimate mathematics. How many steps to the next cover? How many seconds before the enemy's first burst? How little time remained to decide? Each corner became a private battlefield. The larger operations, division movements, artillery timetables, armored thrusts, still existed, but the decisive work often happened in short, personal spaces. Men learned to distrust the quiet. The absence of fire did not mean safety. It meant the enemy had not chosen to reveal himself yet. And when he did, the moment came so quickly that instinct could betray you. Allied units began to refine their drills into habits sturdy enough to survive panic. Instructors reduced complex tactics into simple sequences that could be remembered under stress. Freeze, move, finish. Freeze, because rushing into unknown fire is how hedgerows harvest men. Move, because staying still only gives the enemy time to adjust and reinforce. Finish, because partial solutions invite counterattack. In Normandy, an enemy not fully cleared was an enemy preparing to return. Here, the crude tube gun grew into its intended role. It was not the centerpiece of the battlefield. It did not replace rifles, machine guns, or artillery. But it became a tempo tool, something that compressed time at the decisive moment. When the fight collapsed into a hedge gap, a trench bend, a room, or a bunker entrance, the weapon provided a brutal advantage, the ability to dominate a small space quickly. It did not offer long-range superiority. It offered short-range certainty. That certainty mattered, because the bocage punished hesitation. There was rarely space to recover from a mistake. At close range, the first burst often decided the outcome. A weapon that could deliver controlled fire immediately gave an assault team a way to end a moment before it expanded into a firefight. It turned entries into brief, decisive acts rather than prolonged exchanges. In this terrain, the ability to finish quickly was not aggression, it was survival. German defenses adapted as well. When they felt distance collapsing, they tried to restore it by force. Mines were placed along likely approaches and hedge openings, not merely to kill, but to slow. Wire was strung to catch men and break formations. Positions were arranged to force attackers into predictable lanes where machine guns could reacquire the old advantage of geometry. The battlefield became a contest over whether the fight would happen at 50 yards, where rifles and prepared positions could dominate, or at 5 yards, where the sudden brutality of close assault could overturn them. In the middle of this contest, the soldier's body became its own record of learning. Hands trembled, not from cowardice, but from adaptation, the nervous system rehearsing what the mind could not fully process. A man who had cleared one doorway now approached the next, with a different kind of caution, a memory stored in muscle. He checked his magazine by touch. He listened for sounds he could not name. He felt the weight of the weapon as a promise and a threat. Normandy taught men that fear was not always a failure. Sometimes it was information, and the war's tempo accelerated. The bocage did not allow long deliberation. It demanded quick decisions and punished slow ones. Every hedge line forced a choice. Every corner demanded commitment. Every bunker or strong point became a small problem that had to be solved immediately, because delays piled up, and piled up delays became lost momentum. By the time the Allies pushed deeper into Normandy, the campaign had turned into something both mechanical and intimate. Not a grand sweep of armies, but a chain of brief, violent encounters stitched together across fields and lanes. Victory depended on who could seize the moment faster, who could cross the last few yards, enter the confined space, and end the decision before it could turn against them. In the bocage, this became the real turning point. The war reduced itself to the next 4 seconds, again and again, until strategy began to look like a contest over who owned them. And somewhere ahead, one bunker would test that truth with unforgiving clarity. We return to the lane where the platoon has been pinned, not by numbers, but by certainty. The bunker sits at the end of the corridor like a fixed idea, concrete, angled, patient. Its machine gun does not rage, it controls. The bursts come in measured phrases, sweeping the ground with the confidence of a weapon that believes time belongs to it. Men have learned the pattern now, and that knowledge is its own burden. Knowing when the next burst will come does not remove fear. It simply gives fear a schedule. The corporal lies in the mud and watches the slit, watches the chalk dust jump with each impact. He understands what the bunker is doing, forcing them to wait until waiting becomes paralysis. Then he commits to the flank. He does not rise into the lane like a figure from a painting. He moves the way assault training has taught him, low, uncelebrated, using scraps of cover that barely deserve the name, a shallow fold of earth, a broken tuft of hedge, a crater that offers only inches of protection. Each movement is timed between bursts, his body fitted into the pauses as if the pauses were narrow doors. Behind him, the team does its part. Suppression begins, rifle and light machine gun fire striking the bunker's face, not to break concrete, but to pin attention. Smoke follows, thickening the air in front of the firing slit until the defender's view becomes uncertain. The machine gun's rhythm shifts. It hesitates. It searches. The bunker, for the first time, is forced to guess. The corporal reaches the entrance. There is no speech, no last look. Drilled procedure replaces thought because thought is too slow. The crude tube gun is brought up, the magazine checked by touch, the grip tightened until knuckles whiten under grime. Then the doorway takes him. Inside, 4 seconds are an entire war compressed. The space is tight, concrete close enough to catch sound and throw it back. Darkness broken by muzzle flash. A short, controlled burst that fills the room with shock and metal. A half step to the side, another burst. The weapon speaking at arm's length where distance cannot protect anyone. The bunker's strength becomes its trap. No room to maneuver, no range to regain control. And then, silence. Outside, the machine gun stops as if a hand has closed over its mouth. The lane, moments ago untouchable, becomes passable. Men lift their heads, then rise, then move. The line advances again, not cheering, not celebrating, simply continuing, because continuation is what survival looks like. The corporal emerges with the tube gun still in his hands, and the nickname dies without argument. Contempt is easy in training. It does not survive contact with 4 seconds of decisive truth. After a weapon proves itself in combat, it acquires 2 kinds of reputation. Success spreads stories. Failure spreads rules. The bunker cleared in seconds becomes a tale told with quiet emphasis, passed along a platoon, then a company, then an entire battalion. Men remember the moment the machine gun stopped and the lane opened. They remember the crude tube gun doing what it was built to do. But other memories travel too, less glamorous and more instructive. The jam that came at the wrong time, the magazine that fed poorly, the burst that failed to begin when a life depended on it. Armies are shaped as much by what goes wrong as by what goes right. So doctrine began to absorb the weapon's limits with the same blunt honesty that had produced it. Drills were rewritten. Redundancy was built into assault teams. Another man ready to enter if the first weapon failed. Another weapon close enough to take over without hesitation. The gun was not treated as a miracle. It was treated as a tool that needed a system around it, because a simple mechanism does not forgive careless use. Commanders, too, learned to hold it at the correct distance emotionally. They did not worship it, and they did not dismiss it. They treated it as useful, one answer among many to a specific problem. In a war full of myths, that restraint mattered. Weapons become dangerous when leaders treat them as sacred, because sacred things tempt people to take unnecessary risks. This gun was not sacred. It was practical. Yet the confidence it gave to close assault teams was real, and it began to reshape the way units approached hardened positions. Assault became less of a desperate improvisation and more of an expected procedure. Men began to believe, not in invincibility, but in method. Suppress, blind, flank, enter. The steps mattered because they worked often enough to be trusted. And trust in combat is not a feeling. It is a pattern that holds under stress. In the quiet minutes after a fight, that stress did not disappear. It reappeared in small rituals. A soldier sat with the weapon across his knees and cleaned it with careful patience, as if his hands could prevent the next malfunction by sheer attention. He wiped the feed surfaces, checked the spring tension, examined the magazine lips. It looked like routine maintenance. It was also fear, given a task so it would not consume him. That was the deeper lesson taking hold. Procedure matters as much as hardware. The war had produced a crude, fast tool, but the men had to become equally disciplined to make it reliable. The weapon could compress time at the doorway. The soldier had to earn the right to trust it, and as those rules settled into habit, the turning consolidated. Momentum, the fragile, easily lost advantage of an attacking force, began to survive contact more often, not because the war had become easier, but because men had learned how to carry speed through the most dangerous threshold of all. Liberated ground does not look liberated for long. It looks worked over, scarred by decisions made too close to be clean. After the fighting moves on, the residue remains. Shattered doors hanging crooked on their hinges, timber splintered where men kicked and entered, concrete blackened around firing slits and entrances. The bunker that once governed a lane is reduced to an abandoned cavity, its interior stained by smoke and the brief violence that solved it. Bunker fighting was rarely remembered as spectacle. It was remembered as intimate terror. Not the kind of fear that comes from distant artillery you cannot control, but the kind that comes from proximity, knowing that the enemy is only a few feet away behind a wall, and that the next step will place you within arm's length of him. The war is often described in miles gained and bridges taken. Men who cleared bunkers remembered it in breaths held and corners turned. With that intimacy came ethical weight. Firing into darkness is not the same as firing across open ground. In a doorway, you do not always see a uniform. You see movement, shadow, a shape reacting too late. You fire because procedure demands it, because hesitation is punished, because the man behind you depends on you. And afterward, the mind catches up. What does it mean to pour bullets into a room you cannot fully read? War is full of moral compromises, but few feel as immediate as the moment you commit violence into unseen space. Medics understood another layer of consequence, one that rarely appears in official histories. They saw the hidden economy of seconds. A bunker cleared quickly often meant fewer men bleeding in the lane outside. A team that moved with practiced speed meant fewer wounded waiting for a stretcher under fire. In close combat, time is not a metaphor. It is a resource that can be converted into lives saved or lives lost. The medics did not speak in heroic language. They spoke in triage and transport. Yet they saw, with clinical clarity, what 4 seconds could prevent. Reputation, meanwhile, split along the fault lines of experience. Some men remembered the weapon's failures, the magazine that fed poorly, the stoppage at the wrong moment, the harsh truth that simple could also mean unforgiving. Others remembered the opposite, the silence after the burst, the doorway cleared, the line moving again. Both memories were true. That is why the weapon's legacy was never purely technical. It was personal. What changed was not admiration. It was acceptance. Armies began to treat close-quarters firepower as a requirement, not an accessory, an essential tool for the kind of terrain and fortification that modern war produced. The doctrine matured. Assault teams were equipped and trained with the expectation that fights would collapse into tight spaces, where decisions are made before they can be reconsidered. And so the word cheap was redefined, not as low quality, but as necessity, the ability to exist in numbers, at the moment it was needed, when the alternative was to face concrete with empty hands. After the war, planners tried to distill the conflict into lessons that could be stored, cataloged, and used again. Many of those lessons were tactical, about armor, air power, logistics. But one of the most durable was industrial, and it was learned in the unglamorous corners of production. The war had proven that manufacturability is not a secondary concern. It is strategic. A weapon that cannot be built in time is not a weapon at all. It is an idea. In peacetime, engineers are often judged by refinement. In wartime, they are judged by scale. The crude tube gun was a reminder that simplicity can be doctrine. Not simplicity as a style, but as a system. Rapid output, minimal part count, tolerances that allow mass production, and an acceptance that ugliness is sometimes the price of speed. Post-war arsenals and procurement boards absorbed this logic quietly, even when they preferred not to say it aloud. The romance of craftsmanship still existed, but it could no longer dominate planning the way it once had. Engineers could look at such weapons and praise ingenuity, the cleverness of reduction, the ability to do much with little, the elegance hidden inside the lack of elegance. They could speak of design choices, production efficiencies, and strategic necessity. Soldiers remembered something simpler. They remembered the moment the weapon either fired or failed. In the end, that is how infantry evaluate technology, not by diagrams, but by seconds. A weapon that works under stress becomes part of a man's survival. A weapon that fails becomes part of his story in a different way. Museums would later display the metal itself, tube receivers, stamped components, the plain lines of a gun that never tried to look heroic. Visitors would stand behind glass and see an artifact, a piece of industrial history. Yet the real inheritance was not the object. It was the doctrine that grew around it. The understanding that modern war compresses combat into close spaces and demands tools designed for that compression. The weapon was a symptom. The idea behind it was the enduring lesson. There is a moral irony embedded in that inheritance. Desperation produces blueprints for power. Under threat of invasion and national collapse, Britain accepted designs that would have seemed unacceptable in calmer times. But once proven, those designs did not vanish with the emergency. They became reference points, proof that speed of production and adequacy of performance can outweigh beauty and tradition. The war did not merely destroy, it taught nations how to build more efficiently for the next crisis. That leaves the audience holding two truths at once. On one hand, there is practical brilliance, the ability to solve immediate battlefield problems with industrial clarity. On the other, there is grim necessity, the knowledge that such brilliance is often summoned by fear, by shortage, by the removal of choice. The weapon did what it was asked to do. The reason it was asked remains difficult to celebrate. War accelerates innovation by removing the right to wait. It forces decisions that would otherwise be postponed, and it rewards those who can turn urgency into output. In that sense, the gun's legacy is not confined to one battlefield or one campaign. It is a reminder that in modern conflict, factories and design tables can be as decisive as trenches. And yet, for the men who carried it, the story always returned to a simpler moment, when laughter died and a crude tool became a measure of survival. In hindsight, the nickname sounds like comedy. Plumber's trash, a phrase tossed out with the easy cruelty soldiers reserve for anything that looks beneath the standards they were trained to admire. But in war, mockery is rarely just humor. It is a defense mechanism. If you laugh at a tool, you can pretend you do not depend on it. You can keep a small distance from the uncomfortable truth that your life may soon rest on something crude, stamped, and hurried into existence. The bunker scene, when remembered honestly, offers no romance. It is not a tale of banners and speeches. It is a lesson in timing, a machine gun slit, a lane turned into a killing zone, a man listening to rhythm in the mud. The drama is not in grand gestures. It is in seconds being weighed like lives. 4 seconds inside a doorway decide what hours of planning cannot. Whether momentum survives, whether men behind you get to move, whether the day continues. Weapons rarely change wars on their own. Wars are shaped by production, training, leadership, geography, weather, and the slow grind of logistics. But weapons do change decisive moments. They alter the balance within the narrow spaces where human decisions collide with physics. In the bocage, in stairwells, in trenches, in concrete mouths cut into the earth, distance collapses, and a fight becomes an argument over who acts first. In that compressed world, a crude close-range weapon can matter more than a beautiful long-range one, because beauty does not buy time, so the gun can be judged calmly, without mythology. It was crude. It was imperfect. It could fail if neglected. It demanded discipline from the men who carried it, and sometimes it betrayed them when discipline was not enough. Yet it was suited to a hard truth. At close range, immediacy often defeats elegance. The weapon did not elevate war. It adapted to war as it was, dirty, narrow, and unforgiving. There is a quiet tragedy in that adaptation. Practicality over beauty becomes a recurring rule of modern conflict. Nations do not always build what they admire. They build what they can produce fast enough to survive. The price of that speed is often paid by young men who must trust devices born of desperation, and by societies that learn, again, that urgency is the true engineer of progress. And when the bunker finally falls silent, there is no triumphal scene. Men move past it without celebration, because another corner waits ahead, another hedge line, another doorway. The war does not pause to acknowledge the moment it has just consumed. It simply continues. They called it Plumber's trash, until it cleared a bunker in 4 seconds, and the laughter stopped.